All right, today we are going to be going over section 6.8, calculating percents of change. So if we notice on your notes, we should have the definition of percent of change, which is the percent a quantity increases or decreases from its original amount. That should already be in your notes. We calculate percent of change. You may want to write this down. We take the amount of change and we divide that by the original value. Something you need to make sure that you have in your notes is this fraction right here. We always want that numerator to be positive. And because we want the numerator to be positive, when we calculate that amount of change, or when we calculate that difference, that's another way to say we are finding the difference between the two values. We always want to take big minus small. I always want that numerator to be positive. So I'm going to take the bigger number minus the smaller number. And then in the denominator of my fraction, I'm going to put whatever I started with. My original amount, my start value goes in the denominator. We are going to skip the examples. Those you should have already filled out as your homework. I will be checking those tomorrow. So we are going to go through these quick check problems together. We're going to start with quick check 1, part A. In this problem, we are going from a value of 100 up to a value of 114. So if you notice in the numerator of my fraction, I took big minus small, 114 minus 100. In the denominator of my fraction, I put the original amount. I put a value of 100 in the denominator of my fraction. You need to have every single part of this answer in order to get full credit. So you should have the original part where you show me what you're subtracting. The next step is to simplify that subtraction. So I should see the fraction 14 over 100. Then I want to see that number as a decimal. To find a decimal from a fraction, I simply divide the two numbers, 14 divided by 100, to get the decimal 0.14. Because we're finding percent of change, I then want to change that decimal to a percent. To do that, I multiply by 100, move the decimal 2 places to the right, and I get 14%. This arrow on the end is extremely important because we need to show, is that number increasing or is it decreasing? So we need to show that we have a 14% increase when I'm going from 100 to 114. So every part of that answer is important. I should see all of those parts for all problems. Quick check part B, when we're looking at this first quick check part B, again, we want to take the bigger value minus the smaller value. So I have 3.2 minus 2 in my numerator. In the denominator is always the start value. We started with a value of 2, so that goes in my denominator. I simplify to get 1.2 over 2. When I divide those numbers, I get the decimal 0.6. Moving that decimal 2 places to the right gives me a 60%. Again, we are increasing. 3.2 is larger than 2, so I'm getting bigger. I put an arrow pointing up at the end of my percent. Looking at the last example, part C. Again, we take big minus small. So I have 8,500 minus 4,000. I want that difference to be positive. Then I divide by my original value of 4,000. In this problem, when I simplify that subtraction, I get 4,500 over 4,000. 4,500 is larger than 4,000, which means when I divide these numbers to get a decimal, I should get a decimal larger than 1, and I get 1.125. When I change that decimal to a percent, I move it 2 to the right, and I get 112.5%. So if we notice, I am adding on a number larger than 4,000 to get to 8,500. So my percent of change should be greater than 100%. So I have 112.5% increase when I go from 4,000 to 8,500. Those were all examples of percents of increase. When we look at this quick check 2 here, these problems are different from what's in your notes. So you need to make sure you are either writing these down off to the side or somewhere on a separate sheet of paper. We need to be writing down. You don't have to write down the words, but we want to write down the work from this problem. So for part A, We are going from 60 to 100, meaning we are getting bigger. We do have an increase in this problem. In the numerator of my fraction, I take big minus small, so I have 100 minus 60. In the denominator of my fraction, I put my original amount of 60. That's what we started with. When I simplify, I get 40 over 60 as a fraction. To change that to a decimal, I'm simply going to divide 40 divided by 60, and I get the decimal 0.6 repeating. Now we want to think about when I move that decimal 2 to the right, I'm going to get 66.6 repeating, which means it's about a 67% change. We want to round that 6 up to a 7. These numbers, like we said at the beginning, did get larger, so I have about a 67% increase when I go from 60 to 100. Part B. Part B is a little bit different than anything we've seen so far, only because I'm going from a larger number to a smaller number. So in this problem, I have a percent decrease. In the numerator of my fraction, I still take big number minus small number. So I have 150 minus 137. The denominator is always the original amount, the number that we started with. So then when I simplify, I have 13 over 150. Writing that as a decimal, I get 0.086 repeating. When I move that decimal 2 places to the right to convert it to a percent, I'm going to get 8.66. So I'm going to round that to about an 8.7%. These numbers were getting smaller. I went from a bigger number down to a smaller number, so I am going to have an 8.7% decrease. Remember, that arrow is very important. We need to show whether the values were getting larger with an increase, like in part A, or whether our values were getting smaller, showing a percent decrease, like in part B. Last problem we are going to go over here, part C, we're talking about some poultry consumption. So how much poultry was consumed from 1980 to 1993. So per person in 1980, people consumed 40.6 pounds of poultry, and in 1993, they consumed 61.1 pounds per person. And I want to see what was that percent of change. In the numerator, again, I take bigger number minus smaller number, so 61.1 minus 40.6. In the denominator is always that original amount, which in this problem is 40.6. That's where we started. Simplifying that subtraction, I get 20.5 over 40.6. When I divide those numbers, I get the decimal 0.504. I'm now going to change that decimal to a fraction. So I am going to show that from 1980 to 1993, we had a 50.4% increase in poultry consumption per person. So remember, when you are calculating percent of change, you always take in the numerator the difference. We want bigger number minus smaller number. Always want that value to be positive. In the denominator of the fraction is always the original starting amount. So wherever we started, whatever that original amount was. Make sure you are showing each step of this process for every problem that you do. I should see a fraction, a decimal, and a percent. Make sure you are including that arrow in your answer. We should have either an increase or a decrease. So make sure you are clarifying whether the numbers are getting bigger or getting smaller. Here is your homework for this section for 6.8. Tomorrow when I return, I will be checking 6.8 notes. I will be checking this homework on page 331. I will also be checking 6.9 notes. So your homework for tonight is this bookwork for 6.8 and also to fill out the notes for section 6.9, which we will go over tomorrow.